Hello beekeepers, this is the extreme climate long Langstroth. And no, don't adjust your camera. It is at an angle like that for a reason. And so, other than just being at an angle, there are a couple things that are different about this. So I'll show you them. Now the first thing is we've got these little holes up here with little PVC angles in them. And that's part of a ventilation process there. And this little thing sticking up is just a little stop. So we'll open the roof here and give you a tour. So that's what that stop does. So the inside, the inner covers are all just 1x4s, and I use these straps for handles. So I got one on the top, one on the bottom. It makes it easy to grab. One of these has a bee escape in it. So if we pull this one out, there's a bee escape on the bottom of that. And that's because no matter what you do, when you close the lid, there's always a bee or two. And the space here is just enough for a bee to crawl around and find their way back in. So we use these 1x4s, and I cut slots in them. And these are just 7/8 from the edge. And that makes the slots evenly spaced all the way across the top of the hive, so that in the summer, the hottest of the hot air vents out. In the winter, the wettest, the dampest hot air comes out here, and then it condenses outside of the hive so that it's not dripping down into the bees. So let's take this apart and see what it looks like inside. It's just a standard Langstroth. And I use holes for entrances, because that way when an entrance isn't in use, I can just put a rubber stopper in there. We'll talk about that in a second. But the big reason that I built the hive this way is because in the winter, if we look at a frame and imagine a cluster of bees on there, in the coldest of the cold, the cluster gets very small. And what they'll do is they'll move up. That's the only direction they move when it's super cold. And I mean like 30 below, is they cluster very tightly and move up. And the problem is, if you have a long cold spell, they'll cluster up and they won't have an up to go, and they'll die with honey right next to them. Now, one of the advantages of the lay-ins hive is that they use these long, they basically do this, they turn it on its edge, and they use long frames. The problem with that lay-ins hive is that those are long frames and they're special frames. So this allows you, instead of 9 inches of vertical space, it allows the bees 19 inches from bottom to top. So they have a lot more vertical space using standard Langstroth equipment. And as the heat rises, it comes up and goes out of those slots. So that, remember, the bees don't heat the hive, they heat the cluster. The excess goes up and condenses somewhere. And what we want to do is control where it condenses. So it's going to condense in the coldest spot of the hive. So as it flows out of these slots, it will condense outside here and keep from dripping down on top of the bees. Now in the summer, they can also use this to get rid of excess super hot air if you live in a very hot climate. But if they don't want this, the bees will put propolis on the inside of these slots and block them off. And then as they need it, they'll remove that propolis. So they use that to control their own air conditioning. Okay, so we've got these slots all the way along the top, giving the bees just a little ventilation. And then that air, if it's hot, goes out these holes. And I've got a little bit of mesh in there. This is actually called pet mesh. You can use window screen, whatever you want, just to keep anything out that we don't want, critters living in our hive besides honeybees. So the other thing about a horizontal Langstroth is the follower board is always a pain. Now I use rough cut lumber because I think that's better for the bees. And the thing with rough cut lumber is it's never straight. So building a follower board is a problem because nothing is ever perfectly straight. So what I've done is built a follower board that is 2 pieces. It's kind of most of the way a follower board, and then there's a top block. And what that does is it allows me to have 2 pieces that are kind of wedged apart and make a follower board that adjusts as the sides of the hive are kind of uneven. And it also makes it very easy to move that follower board. If you've ever tried to move a follower board in a long Langstroth, you know what I'm talking about. The art of getting that exactly the right space in all humidities is pretty tough. Okay, now let's take a look at the entrance, which is on the back side underneath the hive. And there are just a few little holes, and when they're not in use, you plug them with rubber stoppers. And I've got very small landing boards compared to a traditional Langstroth. So a couple things about why this is done this way. First of all, in the winter, you don't have to clean this out, right? And when the bees are just barely surviving, dead bees can fall out of there. It's easier for them to kind of push the dead bees out. But you don't have snow accumulating on them, and you don't have rain getting in them. So these are kind of protected openings. Now the other thing about honeybees is they can hover in here and land on that very easily. Small hive beetles can't hover very well. So in fact, I don't think they can hover at all. So they have a much harder time getting in there. And it gives the bees just a little advantage that way. So between keeping the rain and snow out and giving the bees an advantage in the winter, and also the wind doesn't blow directly into the entrance. So in the cold winter, you plug up all but one, and you don't have a wind going directly into the entrance like that. And it is also pretty mouse proof, because a mouse has a hard time climbing down at an angle like that, or climbing up at an angle like that to get into that entrance. So that's why that entrance is like that. It saves a lot of problems for the bees, gives them an advantage. There are the bees doing an orientation flight and using that bottom entrance with no problem. Adjusting to the new hive. So I call it a success.
Alright, and then finally we get to a video of the bees in the hive after they've adjusted to it. And one of the big questions that people have already is, do they really adjust to this orientation? You can see right here that they just build comb the way they normally build comb. There's no adjustment needed. And when you take these frames out, you just slide them out. It's just like a book, pulling a book off a bookshelf. So it's very easy to do. And you know, they've got plenty of room in this one, so there's not a lot to do. But I did want to show how they start. They always go to the highest point in the hive and then work their way down. You can see that happening on this frame. Alright, and that's it. That's the overview of the Extreme Climate Long Langstroth. I hope you found it useful. I also have all the build videos that I took. I just have to squash them together and edit out all those parts where I make stupid mistakes. Or maybe I'll leave them in there. But anyway, if you want to get notification, then click on the little subscribe thing and you'll get notification when I upload that video. I also put notification out there on Facebook, just to make it easy. Alright, that's it. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you soon.